Imagine a bright morning in the heart of ancient Rome. You're standing on a cobbled street, feeling the time-worn stones under your feet. The air hums with the incessant noise of the crowd, the shouts of merchants, the laughter of children, the creaking of chariots, the neighing of horses. You inhale a complex aromatic bouquet that mixes spices from the Far East, smoke from street kitchens, the smell of sweat and dust. You feel like an integral part of this great, invincible, powerful empire that has seemingly conquered the entire known world. But what if I opened your eyes to the hidden truth? To the fact that right under your feet, behind every turn of a narrow street, in every seemingly harmless corner, there were deadly traps lurking. These traps were capable of ending the life of anyone, be it a humble slave, a working plebeian, or even a noble, influential patrician. Ancient Rome was not just the epitome of civilization, power, and grandeur. It was a real, relentless arena of constant struggle for survival. Here, danger waited where it was least expected, turning every day into a test of strength and endurance. We used to think of the Romans as conquerors, but they were primarily masters of survival. From everyday, seemingly insignificant threats that accumulated and undermined health, to sophisticated and hidden traps created by nature or by man himself, from which neither high social status, nor fabulous wealth, nor even personal protection saved. Are you ready to plunge into this world where every breath could be the last, where death could lie in wait in the most unexpected and seemingly safe places? Are you ready to learn about the traps that remain invisible to most, but took thousands of lives? Then stay tuned, because today we will reveal the most shocking and little-known secrets of the most dangerous Roman traps, which you probably didn't even know about. Get ready, this will be a journey not just into the past, but into the very heart of Drevnarim darkness, where survival was not just an instinct, but a real art that requires constant vigilance and luck. The Roman Empire, majestic aqueducts, mighty legions, grandiose buildings. At first glance, life in ancient Rome seems filled exclusively with triumphs, unprecedented grandeur, and unshakable stability. But what if I asked you to look beyond the glittering gold of imperial palaces, the marble columns of temples, and the pomp of triumphal processions to see a much darker, harsher, and more pitiless reality? A reality full of dangers that you probably didn't even know existed. The same invisible threats that lurked in the eternal city for every inhabitant. You probably imagine Roman streets as wide, cobbled avenues, ideal for grand processions and busy shopping, leisurely walks and meetings with friends. You are deeply mistaken, and your idea is shattered by the harsh reality. In fact, they were a veritable deadly obstacle course, where every careless step could be the last. These streets, always incredibly crowded with people, numerous vehicles such as bulky carts and light chariots, and animals ranging from donkeys to cattle, were constantly in a state of chaos. They were filthy due to the lack of adequate sanitation and poorly lit, especially after dusk, when only a few lanterns and light from taverns dispelled the gloom. These were not just passageways, but a real maze full of invisible, but no less dangerous traps. Open gutters lay directly along the streets were overflowing with sewage, household garbage, and waste. They could cause not only a banal fall, which could lead to serious injuries, from painful dislocations to bone fractures, but also in rainy weather turned into raging, stinking streams. These torrents could easily carry gawky, weak, or simply inattentive passers-by into the dark, fetid depths of the city sewers, where the chances of escape were slim. There was no centralized garbage collection system in Rome. The waste was often thrown directly out of the insulae windows onto the streets, which were littered with mountains of rotting waste under the scorching sun. This created ideal conditions for the rapid reproduction of bacteria, insects that carry diseases, and, as a result, the lightning spread of deadly epidemics. Getting sick in ancient Rome meant coming face to face with the harsh, unforgiving reality of a lack of modern hygiene, effective medicines, and qualified medical care. Even the smallest scratch, cut, or corn could lead to a painful infection that quickly turned into sepsis. A common cold, which we now easily treat with a couple of pills, could turn into fatal pneumonia, tuberculosis, or other complications due to weakened immunity and unsanitary conditions. Going out on the street, you always put your life on the line because any seemingly minor trouble could be fatal, and the invisible enemy in the form of bacteria was much more dangerous than any armed robber. The lack of traffic rules and speed controls made the streets even more dangerous. Chariots and carts, often running at full speed, were a deadly threat. Pedestrian collisions were common, and many were killed or seriously injured, leaving them permanently disabled. At night, the streets were completely dark, only occasionally illuminated by the occasional oil lamp or torchlight from passers-by. At this time, the danger increased many times. Not only could you trip and fall into a ditch, but you could also fall victim to robbers for whom the dark alleys were the perfect place to ambush. Roman streets were not just a place to move around, but a dynamic, chaotic environment where vigilance was the key to survival. In addition, the Romans were not concerned about the safety of construction work. If construction or repairs were being carried out, construction debris and tools could simply lie on the street, creating additional obstacles. Broken rocks, boards with nails sticking out, and holes dug for plumbing or repairs were often left without fences or warning signs. In a crowd, it was easy to fall prey to pickpockets and thieves. Despite strict laws, crime flourished in the slums of Rome, where poverty and desperation drove people to desperate acts. Assaults, robberies, and even murders were part of the daily criminal record, which of course was not written about in solemn eulogies. Rome, the city of greatness, was also a city where surviving on the streets was a real challenge. It was a city of contrasts, the dazzling splendor of luxury on the Palatine and Forum, next to the squalor and filth of the Subura, where every dark alley was a threat. Behind the majestic facades that we see today on the ruins of ancient cities, there was a much darker truth. Multi-story, insula-cramped residential buildings for the common people. For the plebeians were not just housing, but real powder barrels, ready to explode at any moment. These buildings, built in haste to accommodate the growing population of Rome as quickly as possible, were built with the cheapest and lowest quality materials, such as raw bricks, clay, wood, and, most importantly, without observing any basic building codes and safety rules that, in fact, did not exist in the past. Our understanding. As a result, they were constantly under threat of sudden and catastrophic collapse. Wooden frames that eventually rotted and collapsed under the influence of moisture and insects, dilapidated rickety stairs that could collapse under your feet at any moment, and overloaded floors, which sometimes lived for several families. All this created the perfect conditions for a construction disaster that could occur at any moment without warning. And of course, fires were not uncommon, but a real, all-consuming disaster. Cooking and heating fires burned in every dwelling, often open and without proper ventilation. The fire, sparked by anything from a fallen candle to a spark from the hearth, spread like lightning across the dry wooden floors and beams, turning the house into a flaming torch. The narrow streets did not allow for a quick delivery of water, and there were very few means to extinguish the fire. Thousands of Romans perished every year under the rubble of their homes or burned down in the fire for years, with no chance of escape. Your own home, your only refuge and resting place, could at any moment turn into a fiery or stone death trap, where escape was almost impossible and death came quickly and painfully. However, in addition to the threat of collapse and fires, the insula contained another, less obvious, but no less deadly trap on sanitary conditions and diseases. Most plebeian apartments did not have their own kitchens, toilets, or running water. Residents used communal latrines, which were often clogged and overcrowded, which led to the spread of feces and urine in common areas and even on the streets. The lack of running water in the apartments meant that personal hygiene was extremely difficult. Sewage and waste were thrown directly from the windows into the street, creating stinking puddles and an ideal breeding ground for rodents, insects, and pathogenic bacteria. Imagine the cramped space. Several people, or even a whole family, could be crammed into one room. Such crowding contributed to the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Epidemics of plague, smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis were common in crowded insula areas. A single patient's cough could infect dozens of people in an apartment building. One person's illness quickly became a threat to the whole house and then to the entire area. In addition to the physical threats, Living in insula was a huge psychological pressure. Constant noise, lack of personal space, unpleasant odors, lack of sunlight in many rooms. All this led to stress, depression, and increased depression. Neighbors often clashed over noise, water, or location. In such conditions, even a minor illness could become a death sentence due to lack of treatment and a weakened body, and chronic stress undermined the immune system. Insula were not just houses, but death traps where everyday life was a constant struggle for survival. Extraterrestrial intervention and cosmic cataclysms. External influence. One of the most radical yet intriguing hypotheses explaining the phenomenal achievements and sudden decline of ancient Egypt lies beyond Earth's borders, the theory of alien interference. If Egyptian gods such as Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Thoth were not just mythological entities but representatives of highly advanced extraterrestrial civilizations that visited Earth in ancient times, this could explain the inexplicable leap in the development of Egyptian civilization. These gods could bring with them not only knowledge in the field of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, but also advanced technologies that were perceived as magic, and their deeds eventually turned into myths. Imagine that grand structures like the Great Pyramid of Giza were built using anti-gravity devices or sound technology passed down by these aliens. But for the common plebeian, who probably could only afford to visit these establishments once a week, the baths could become a source of much greater danger than it seems at first glance, turning into a real biological trap. Hygiene in these crowded public spaces was very conventional and far from modern standards. The water in the huge pools was changed infrequently, and thousands of people, many of whom were carriers of various infections and diseases, shared the same baths, pools, steam rooms, laconics, dry steam rooms, and changing rooms. Imagine an ideal environment for the rapid spread of infections. Moist, warm air, large crowds of people, and water that could be contaminated. Здесь процветала skin diseases such as scabies, ringworm, and eczema flourished here. Gastrointestinal disorders caused by bacteria entering the water, tuberculosis, smallpox, and other dangerous diseases transmitted by airborne droplets or contact. Common scrapers, shears, which the Romans used to clean the skin of sweat and dirt, passing from hand to hand. Common towels rarely washed, the lack of any disinfection of surfaces, benches, walls. All this turned the baths into real hotbeds of deadly epidemics. You went there to purify yourself and relax, get a portion of pleasure and social interaction, or you could get a one-way ticket, catching a disease that will leave you no chance of recovery because there were no effective drugs. This paradox, the desire for cleanliness, which turns into a deadly threat, is one of the darkest pages of Roman everyday life. In addition to infections, the Roman baths were also fraught with other, less obvious, but very serious threats. The very procedures in the thermal baths, with their alternation of hot and cold air, could become dangerous for people with heart or breathing problems. The constant transition from the calidarium, hot room, to the tepidarium, warm room, and then to the frigidarium, cold room, created sudden temperature changes that could cause overheating, loss of consciousness, or even a heart attack in the weakened or elderly. In hot, humid rooms, it was easy to slip on the wet floor and get seriously injured from a bruise to a fracture. The smooth marble floors were covered with water and soap suds and turned into a skating rink. But physical exercises, such as wrestling or throwing a ball, were often performed in the baths, which also increased the risk of injury. In a crowd, especially during rush hours, it was easy to bump into, fall over, or get hurt by another person's careless movement. In addition, special oils and aromatic substances were used in the thermal baths, which could cause allergic reactions or irritation of the respiratory tract in some people. And prolonged exposure to hot water and steam rooms, especially for those who were already weakened or dehydrated, could lead to serious violations of the body's water-salt balance. Thus, the Roman baths, being a place of pleasure and hygiene, were at the same time a complex trap, where health risks were widespread and varied, requiring visitors to be in good health and careful. Roman aqueducts are an undoubted marvel of ancient engineering, a grandiose system that provides a city with uninterrupted water supply. However, even they, being the pinnacle of technology of their time, could not guarantee absolute security. The water flowing into the city through a complex system of pipes was often contaminated with lead leached from lead water pipes, which were widely used in the Roman water supply system because of their pliability and durability. Chronic lead poisoning was common among the Romans, especially among the nobility, who had access to clean tap water but were unaware of its deadly component. These poisonings have manifested as excruciating headaches, severe digestive problems such as colic, constipation, and diarrhea, as well as neurological and mental disorders including memory loss, depression, irritability, and even insanity. In addition, even if the water did not contain lead, it could contain various pathogens that cause epidemics of intestinal infections. Rainwater collection tanks and public street fountains, accessible primarily to the plebeians and the poorest, were even more dangerous. The water stagnated in them, dirt, algae, insect larvae accumulated, and most importantly, bacteria and viruses quickly multiplied. Not surprisingly, drinking water, as it is, was extremely risky, especially in the summer heat, when infections spread at lightning speed, causing outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. Many Romans, aware of these implicit risks, preferred to drink diluted wine or vinegar drink posa, which, due to the content of alcohol or acid, had disinfectant properties and helped kill some of the bacteria. These drinks were not just for pleasure or thirst quenching, but served as a form of hygiene. Consider the paradox. In a city teeming with water thanks to the great aqueducts, a clean, safe sip could be a true luxury, and the contaminated liquid could be the hidden cause of a slow but certain death, from which neither wealth nor faith in the gods saved. It would seem that service in the Roman army is the embodiment of courage, the path to glory, the opportunity to get citizenship and enviable stability. But for a mere legionnaire who had sworn allegiance to the empire and was willing to give his life for it, the army was not only full of battle with external enemies, but also a hidden, much more insidious trap for his own health. Wars and campaigns were not only battles with the enemy, but also a constant struggle for survival in inhumane conditions. Long, grueling marches in scorching sun or heavy rain through mountain passes or swamps, harsh, Spartan living conditions in marching camps where hygiene was minimal and water was often polluted, and a meager, monotonous diet made soldiers incredibly vulnerable to a host of diseases. Epidemics of typhoid, dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and smallpox decimated the legions much faster and more effectively than the fiercest battles against the barbarians. According to historians, up to 80% of all losses in the Roman army were due to diseases. Wounded soldiers, even if their wounds appeared minor, often faced excruciating infections. Gangrene that led to amputations of limbs without anesthesia, or a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. The lack of qualified medical care, lack of antibiotics and basic sanitation made the chances of survival extremely low. Field hospitals, if they existed at all, were primitive, and bandages and instruments were non-sterile. The army was not only a machine for conquest and maintaining order, but also a relentless meat grinder, grinding not only enemies on the battlefield, but also their own soldiers, leaving them no chance to live to old age, dying in the prime of life from causes unrelated to combat and from invisible killers lurking in the environment. We are used to imagining gladiators as fearless heroes fighting in the arena for freedom, popular love, and immortality in history. But in fact, their lives were filled not only with bloody, deadly fights in front of crowds of cheering spectators, but also with a lot of more prosaic but no less dangerous everyday threats that turned their existence into a real death trap. Training in gladiator schools or ludus wasn't just grueling, it was brutal, relentless, and often resulted in severe injuries, broken bones, dislocated joints, sprained muscles, and tendons that, without proper treatment and rehabilitation, became chronic, making life a constant, unbearable pain. Constant blows, falls, lacerations, and stab wounds from blunt training swords and other weapons, all this slowly but surely eroded the health of the fighters. Their bodies were essentially tools for entertainment, and they were used mercilessly by IAS. Even if the gladiator miraculously survived in the Colosseum arena, avoiding the opponent's fatal blow or the emperor's merciful gesture, his body was worn to the limit. Every muscle and joint ached, Internal organs could be damaged, and injuries would accumulate. Infections, chronic pain, permanent disability, a disfigured body with countless scars. This is what most often awaited those who passed through the crucible of gladiator fights. This was not just an arena, it was a trap in which even the winner, if he survived, lost his health, a full life, and, ultimately, died from the consequences of his triumphant craft, much earlier than the deadline. The greatness of the Roman Empire, its grandiose buildings, majestic temples, impregnable fortresses, luxurious villas, and developed infrastructure required a huge amount of building stone. And the power of the army, the prosperity of trade, and even the everyday needs of citizens depended on the extraction of metals such as iron, copper, silver, and gold. All this material was extracted in the horrific, inhumane conditions of underground quarries and mines, where thousands of slaves and convicts worked. These places were not just work sites, but real death traps, where every breath was poison and every step was a risk. The air in the mines was saturated with fine rock dust containing silicon dioxide, as well as harmful gases that slowly but surely destroyed the lungs of workers, causing silicosis and other respiratory diseases. Collapses and collapses of mine vaults caused by ground instability or primitive mining methods occurred with frightening regularity, burying whole shifts of workers alive who had no chance of escape. The backbreaking, exhausting labor from dawn to dusk, in the semi-darkness and stuffiness, without sufficient food and rest, exhausted even the strongest men. The lack of proper ventilation, constant dampness, cold and grueling work schedule in a confined space made these places a real hell on earth. The workers developed chronic diseases of the joints, back, and lungs. Many slaves did not live to reach the age of 30, turning into the living dead, slowly being killed by overwork in a toxic environment from which there was no escape but death. Their bodies became part of the very empire they were building, but their suffering remained invisible, buried beneath the grandeur of Roman structures. Even in the bosom of nature, in the picturesque countryside where it would seem a person should be closer to health and harmony, the Roman was ambushed by hidden but no less dangerous threats. Agricultural work, especially in the summer heat, was incredibly grueling, requiring enormous physical effort and often leading to heat and sunstroke, as well as severe dehydration, especially for slaves who were restricted access to water. But that's not all. The Romans, unaware of the harm and toxicity, widely used various substances, including lead and mercury compounds, as well as other minerals, as pesticides to protect crops from pests and diseases. These toxic substances settled on the fruits, polluted the soil, and, most importantly, water in local springs and wells, from which both workers and livestock drank. As a result, those who constantly worked in the fields and drank this contaminated water developed chronic poisoning. Symptoms ranged from digestive problems such as nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, to skin rashes, as well as more serious damage to the nervous system, kidneys, and liver. The lack of a balanced diet, constant hard physical labor under the scorching sun, without interruptions and exposure to toxins, turned ordinary agricultural work into a slow but sure trap for health, which gradually sapped the vital forces of a person, leading to premature death or severe disability. The life of a rural worker, seemingly simple, was filled with invisible dangers that made it no less risky than the life of a city dweller. Food in ancient Rome, especially for the plebeians and the poorest sections of the population, was not just a matter of food, but a real lottery with death. The lack of strict quality standards, basic hygiene standards, and effective state supervision of markets and bakeries allowed unscrupulous merchants to sell spoiled or outright substandard products, putting thousands of people at risk. Bread, which was the mainstay of the Roman diet, was often baked from poorly refined flour. It could contain impurities of sand, ash, small stones, or even sawdust due to primitive grain grinding methods. This led not only to tooth decay, but also to chronic digestive problems, intestinal disorders, and internal inflammation. Meat, if it was available to ordinary people at all, which was extremely rare, often turned out to be stale, infected with parasites, or belonged to sick animals, causing serious food poisoning, which in the absence of antibiotics often led to death. Fruits and vegetables grown using questionable fertilizers, such as human excrement or sewage from urban landfills, could also be a source of intestinal infections, parasites, and other diseases. But the most insidious and deadly trap was fake food. For example, diluted or tainted wine, to which unscrupulous merchants could add toxic substances lead to improved color or tartness. Copper sulfate to lighten to hide poor quality. Your meager meal, your only chance to fill up and recuperate after a hard day, could at any time cause a serious and sometimes excruciatingly fatal illness, turning food from a source of life into a source of death. And finally, the most insidious, sophisticated, and unpredictable trap of ancient Rome, from which neither walls nor wealth nor even legions could save. This is political intrigue. For the common plebeian, who might have been an unwitting witness or even victim of circumstances, and for many members of the nobility, senators, and even imperial advisors, any connection, even the most insignificant, with influential persons, any careless words spoken in a busy forum, in a noisy tavern, or even in private conversation, could lead to a serious crime. Catastrophic, fatal consequences. The system of denunciations, or delatores, was widespread and actively encouraged by the authorities, especially during periods of political instability, power struggles, and the rule of paranoid emperors. Any ill-wisher, envious person, competitor, or open enemy could falsely accuse a person of plotting against the emperor, of insulting his greatness, crimen lese majestatis, of treason to the motherland, or of any other fictitious treason. Such accusations were often based on gossip, rumors, or personal animosity. The lawlessness and widespread corruption of Rome's judicial system meant that even an absolutely innocent person who had committed no crimes could be quickly sentenced to death, agonizing torture, confiscation of all property, or exile without real evidence in a fair investigation. There was no guarantee of a fair trial. Your life may have been cut short not by a gladiator's sword in the arena, not by the collapse of the insula wall, not by a fatal illness, but by a treacherous rumor, envy, personal revenge, or cold, calculating political ambition. It was an invisible trap from which there was no escape, because no one could be sure of the future and that his name would not appear in someone's denunciation, casting a shadow on his loyalty and loyalty. It loomed over everyone, from the lowest to the highest strata of society, turning Rome into a realm of constant, pervasive paranoia. So we plunged into the dark depths of ancient Rome and saw that it was not only a glittering city of grandeur, unsurpassed architecture, and mighty power, but also a place where danger lurked at every seemingly safe step. From crumbling buildings and hidden threats on dirty streets, to deadly diseases waiting in public baths, to insidious political intrigues capable of destroying anyone. Surviving in this grandiose but ruthless empire was a daily hard feat. The Romans, faced with such a kaleidoscope of threats, were incredibly adapted to these harsh conditions. They found ways to deal with countless dangers, adapt to them, and survive against whatever fate threw at them. Their amazing resilience, unprecedented ingenuity, and amazing strength of spirit, ability to community mutual assistance, allow us today to better understand what an incredible price was achieved for the true greatness of this eternal civilization. It was a survival lesson they taught the world. I hope that this fascinating and sometimes slightly creepy story has helped you to look at ancient Rome from a completely new angle, to understand the depth of the challenges and dangers that its inhabitants faced, and to understand how fragile and precious human life was in those times. If you like this fascinating and informative story, and you want to learn even more about the hidden, little-known secrets of history, about the invisible threads connecting the past and present, be sure to subscribe to our channel and put a like. We will be happy to share with you new, even more amazing and shocking facts from the past that will make you reconsider your ideas about long-past eras. What other mysteries of the ancient world would you like us to solve for you? Tell us about it in the comments. Your opinion is very important for us, and we are always happy to have a new idea for research.